In a converted apple barn outside Traverse City, Michigan, string lights swayed over long wooden tables, and a woman named Dana Voss stood near the cider bar holding a glass of wine she had no intention of finishing. She had practiced, for exactly this kind of moment, a particular smile, the kind that costs nothing and gives nothing away. Her younger sister was crossing the room toward her with a stranger in tow, a silver-haired man in a charcoal suit who had flown in from Chicago for this wedding, and who, within the next 20 minutes, would say a single sentence that unraveled everything Dana's family believed about who she was. Nobody in that barn knew that the man now walking across the dance floor had spent 3 years quietly trying to track down the very woman his hostess was about to introduce as a failure. This is the story of the night. A family's quietest member got handed back a life everyone had assumed she'd lost, and the harder choice she made once she had it back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Dana Voss had once run strategy for firms whose names filled business school case studies. Now, at her son's wedding, she was the woman relatives described in careful, pitying half-sentences. Her sister, Faith Rourke, had built a corner office and a title at Kestrel Advisory Group, and she wore both like jewelry. Somewhere between them stood Grant, the groom, a young analyst at that very firm, who had no idea his mother's fingerprints were already on the walls of the company he worked for. 3 questions hung over that barn before the toasts even began. Why had Dana disappeared from an industry that once could not stop calling her name? What did Faith's calm, silver-haired CEO actually know about the woman his manager kept mocking? And when the truth finally surfaced in front of 100 wedding guests, which sister would still be standing at the end of the night? The answers arrived faster and colder than anyone at that reception was prepared for. 3 years earlier, Dana Voss had been 40 floors up in a glass conference room in Chicago, days from being named managing partner at a strategy firm she had spent 2 decades trying to reach. She had done it without a wealthy father, a convenient marriage, or a mentor clearing the runway. People in the industry used the word self-made about her the way other people used a job title. She had built, among other things, a client loyalty mapping framework that quietly spread through the consulting world the way good ideas do. Used everywhere, credited nowhere, its author forgotten faster than the framework itself. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Her mother, Louise, 68 at the time, had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The kind of diagnosis that arrives with numbers instead of comfort. Dana stepped into the hallway outside the glass conference room, looked down at a city she had spent 20 years climbing toward, and did the only math that mattered to her in that moment. She walked back inside and withdrew her name from consideration for partner that same afternoon. When the family gathered by speakerphone to decide who would step back to care for Louise, Faith answered fast, the way a person answers when they have rehearsed the refusal in advance. "I can't just walk away from what I've built right now," she said. She was a mid-level manager then, newly promoted, terrified of losing ground she had barely secured. Dana understood that fear better than she wanted to. She had built her own ladder in the rain, and knew exactly what it cost to imagine letting go of a rung. So she volunteered, half out of love and half out of a pride she wouldn't examine until much later, not knowing yet that the world keeps two separate ledgers, one for the people who stay and one for the people who leave. The 2 years that followed emptied Dana's old life without ceremony. She sold her downtown condominium and moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental near her mother's house in Petoskey, so the money would stretch further. She learned the language of oncology fluently, and against her will, learned which nurses were gentle at 6 in the morning and which were merely efficient. Her phone, once buzzing from dawn until midnight with people who needed her judgment, went quiet, then silent, then dead, and she didn't have the energy left to grieve that loss on top of everything else already leaving her. One night, during a rare stretch of clarity the medication allowed, Louise took her daughter's hand and said something Dana would carry for the rest of her life. "They will measure you by the room you're standing in," her mother told her. "Don't you dare measure yourself the same way." Dana laughed and told her she was being dramatic. Louise said she was dying and had earned the right to be. They both laughed for real that time. It was the last good week either of them would have. Louise died the following spring. At the funeral, something quietly cruel began to happen. People started speaking about Dana in the past tense, as though she too had died a little. An aunt patted her arm and murmured what a shame it was that Dana used to be so impressive. Faith flew in for 2 days, wore elegant black, cried in a way that drew comfort from every corner of the room, and by the reception had somehow become the grieving daughter, while Dana had quietly become the tired woman who'd simply been handling things. Nobody in that kitchen had been present for the 6 a.m. drives or the last good week, and yet everyone there felt entitled to decide what those 2 years had been worth. Faith's version of the story did not cast Dana as a hero. It cast her as a cautionary tale. A year passed in paperwork and a strange, heavy quiet. Then Grant called with news that cracked something warm open in Dana's chest. For the first time in a long while, he was marrying Priya Anand, a steady, kind young woman from a respected local family, and he wanted his mother there. Near the end of that call, though, his voice thinned. "Aunt Faith's going to be there," he said carefully. "And she's got her whole thing about you being between jobs. Can you just not engage with it? For me, it's one day." He was 27 and afraid of a scene at his own wedding, and Dana heard, underneath the request, exactly which sister her son had quietly decided was the risk to manage. Not the one who mocked, the one who might mind being mocked. She told him, of course, and meant it, and it cost her something she didn't yet have a name for. Then, gently, she asked one more question. Where exactly did he work again? He told her without a second thought. Kestrel Advisory Group, where Faith had helped him land the interview, and where he was, in his words, learning a ton as a junior analyst. Dana kept her voice level and said that was a fine firm. What she didn't say was that she knew Kestrel. She had competed against it for a decade, beaten it on some pitches, and lost to it on others, and years ago had built a loyalty mapping framework that Kestrel had eventually folded into its own methodology so thoroughly that, by now, nobody there likely remembered it had ever belonged to anyone at all. Her sister had spent years climbing a ladder built partly from Dana's own uncredited work, without a single reason to suspect it, because she had never once asked her sister a real question about who she used to be. The rehearsal dinner was held Friday evening in a private dining room at a restaurant overlooking Grand Traverse Bay. The kind of place where the staff refolded your napkin the moment you stepped away from the table. Priya's parents, Ravi and Meena Anand, were gracious in the careful way of people still deciding what to make of their new in-law family. Dana wore the one good dress she'd kept from her old life and felt, for an hour, like a museum piece of herself. Faith arrived like she had reserved the room personally. She wore a new watch and an even newer confidence, and within 10 minutes, she had gathered a small audience near the window, telling stories that all seemed to end with her being right about something. Dana found a chair near the edge of the room, which by now felt less like exile and more like a good vantage point, because from the edge, you can watch exactly who a person becomes when they believe the people who matter most are the only ones watching. All evening, Faith kept glancing toward the door, waiting for someone more important than the rest of the table to arrive. That someone did not appear at the rehearsal dinner, but he came up in nearly every third sentence anyway. "My CEO," Faith kept saying. "Dean is incredibly selective." She told a long story about a presentation she'd once redone overnight to win his approval, saying his name, Dean Ashcroft, the way some people say the name of a saint whose attention they're courting. She dropped it in front of Ravi Anand, who nodded politely, and in front of Grant, who beamed with pride on his aunt's behalf. She dropped it too, while glancing at Dana, as if to make sure her older sister understood the distance between a woman who reported to Dean Ashcroft and a woman who reported to no one at all. It was Meena Anand who asked, kindly, over the appetizer course, "And what do you do, Dana?" A simple, human question. Dana opened her mouth to answer honestly, that she had stepped back from consulting to care for her mother and was now considering what came next, which was the truth and not a shameful one. But Faith answered first, laughing lightly. "Oh, Dana's between things right now," she said. "She's been between things for a while." She wrapped the insult in fondness so carefully that anyone who flinched at it would look unkind for flinching. Meena smiled uncertainly and moved the conversation along, and Dana sat there, having just been introduced to her son's new in-laws as a woman defined entirely by absence, as if the 2 years she'd spent holding her dying mother's hand were a gap in a timeline rather than the fullest thing she had ever done. Dana said only, evenly, "That's one way to put it, Faith," and let it go, because she had promised her son peace, and she intended to keep that promise. But some words get filed away, rather than forgotten. She stepped outside for air after the entree, and Priya followed her out. Grant, it turned out, had married up in the way that actually matters. Priya stood beside Dana in the cool bay air, and after a moment, said quietly, "Grant told me you took care of your mom for a couple of years. That must have been so hard." It was such a small thing to say, and it was the whole thing at once. The first time in 3 years, anyone outside that hospital room had asked Dana about the life she had actually lived, rather than the empty space everyone else saw around it. Dana told her a little. The 6 a.m. drives, the gentle nurses, the last good week. Priya listened as though it mattered. "That's not nothing," she said. "That's kind of everything." Dana had to look at the water for a moment before she could speak again. The moment that stayed with Dana longest that night, though, happened over dessert. And it happened with paper. Ravi Anand mentioned, almost in passing, that his clinics might need outside strategy help down the line. Nothing formal, just thinking aloud. Faith moved like she'd smelled the water change. She pulled a small stack of business cards from her bag. Kestrel Advisory Group embossed in navy, her name in clean lettering beneath it, and fanned them across the tablecloth toward Ravi like a winning hand of cards. Then she turned to Dana, let the silence sit a beat too long, and said, "Do you have one to give them, Dana? Anything at all?" The table went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet, when everyone understands the real question isn't about business cards, it's about whether a person still counts. Dana had left her old cards in a drawer 3 years earlier along with the rest of that life, and she hadn't made new ones because she didn't yet know what they'd say. She said no. She was fresh out and smiled the way you smile when you've decided the moment isn't worth defending. Faith smiled back, satisfied, and the dessert plates arrived, and the moment passed for everyone at that table but her. Dana carried those fanned navy cards in her mind, long after the dinner ended, all the way to the following night's reception. That night, back at her rented condo overlooking the bay, Dana did something she hadn't done in a long while. She took down an old shoebox from the top of her closet. Not documents, nothing she could have waved in Faith's face. Just a single photograph from an industry conference 15 years earlier. In it, she stood in a blazer and a conference badge beside her mother, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Louise used to fly in for those keynotes, sit quietly in the back of rooms she didn't fully understand, and beam anyway. Dana sat on the floor with that photograph for a long time, asking herself a question she had been outrunning for 3 years. If she produced nothing, was she still something? It was an ugly question to catch herself asking, because it meant some part of her had quietly started believing Faith's arithmetic, the world's arithmetic, that a woman without a title was a woman without worth. She didn't cry over it. She just let the question sit, honestly, because a person cannot fix a rot they refuse to name. Her mother's voice returned to her from that last good week. "They'll measure you by the room you're standing in. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way." Dana slid the photograph into her purse before bed. She didn't fully know why. She just wanted her mother at the wedding. The morning of the ceremony, Grant came to find his mother in the small room off the orchard's reception hall, needing help with his tie, the way he always had since he was a boy. His hands were shaking with nerves. Dana tied the knot the way her own father had once taught her, smoothed his collar, and looked at her son in the mirror beside her own reflection. His face crumpled slightly. "Mom," he said, "what I asked you on the phone, about Aunt Faith, that wasn't fair of me. I know it wasn't." Dana told him it was fine, and meant it as a gift rather than a sacrifice, and promised him she would not be a single ounce of trouble that day. He hugged her the way he used to when he was small and scared of thunder. Neither of them yet knew that peace would not be Dana's to keep or break that evening. Someone else was about to reach for the pin. The ceremony itself was short and lovely. the way ceremonies should be, held beneath the orchard's oldest apple trees, with the late afternoon light slanting gold through the branches. The reception followed inside Cider Row Barn, string lights strung between the exposed beams, long farm tables set with white linen and jars of wildflowers. Dana was seated well back, near a great aunt and two of Priya's college friends, a placement she understood without needing it explained. The front tables were reserved for the people the day was performing for. From the back of the room, Dana watched her sister work the crowd, orbiting one man in particular all evening. Silver-haired, mid-50s, dressed in a suit that fit like it had been grown rather than bought. Calm, in the specific way genuinely powerful people are calm, taking up no more space than necessary. She recognized the choreography before she recognized the man. She had once been the person a room arranged itself around, and she knew exactly what it looked like when someone wanted badly to be arranged around in return. This, she understood without yet knowing his name, was Dean Ashcroft, the CEO whose approval Faith had spent an entire rehearsal dinner performing devotion to. Then Faith looked across the barn, found Dana at her small back table, and began crossing the room toward her, with Dean Ashcroft in tow. Dana understood what was coming, the way you understand weather rolling in. She straightened her back, an old reflex from another life, muscle memory from boardrooms these people didn't know she'd ever sat in. Priya, seeing the trajectory from across the room, started moving too, though she was too far away to reach the table in time. Grant was near the head table, laughing, unaware. And Faith arrived at Dana's table glowing, gesturing at her sister with an open hand like a hostess presenting a curiosity, and turned to the calm silver-haired man beside her to make the introduction that would end her career before the entrees were even cleared. "Dean," Faith said, bright as a bell, "this is my sister, the one I told you about. Dana, the unemployed one, lives off the family. Between things for years now. Bless her." She said it about her own sister, at her own nephew's wedding, to her own CEO, smiling as though it were affection wrapped carefully enough that anyone who flinched would look unkind for flinching. The great aunt beside Dana inhaled sharply. One of Priya's friends studied her plate, and Dana did the thing 3 years of being narrated by people who were never in the room had trained her to do. She laughed, gently, almost kindly, and looked up at Dean Ashcroft and said the truest, quietest thing she had left. "She's right," Dana said. "I don't have a title anymore." She meant it, for 1 second, as surrender. And then the sentence turned in her own mouth even as she finished saying it, because a title had never once been the thing that made her who she was. Across the table, Dean Ashcroft went very still and set his glass down on the linen, slowly and deliberately, and looked at Dana the way no one had looked at her in 3 years, like she was a person worth focusing on entirely. "I'm sorry," he said, ignoring Faith completely. "I don't believe we've met properly. What did you say your name was?" "Dana," she told him. Faith jumped in before the silence could settle. Unable to bear a gap in the conversation, she believed she still controlled. "Voss," she added quickly. "She's a Voss, like me, obviously." She laughed again, trying to steer the moment back onto rails only she could see. Dean Ashcroft's eyes didn't leave Dana's face. "Dana Voss," he repeated slowly, and something shifted behind his eyes. A file being pulled down from a high shelf. Not the Dana Voss. Not the one who built the loyalty mapping framework. The great aunt looked confused. Faith's smile developed a hairline crack, because those were not words she had ever imagined hearing attached to the sister she'd spent years quietly shrinking. "I wrote a version of it," Dana said carefully. "A long time ago." Dean Ashcroft exhaled, something close to a short, surprised laugh, and shook his head slowly. "A long time ago," he repeated. "My entire client strategy division still runs on your long time ago." The table had gone completely silent now. Faith's hand found the back of a chair to steady herself. Dean explained it plainly, which somehow made it land harder, that Kestrel had adopted Dana's framework across the entire firm years earlier, that it had become, in his words, the backbone of how the company made decisions, and that when he'd taken over as CEO 3 years prior, the very first outside hire he'd wanted to make was the woman who had built it. "Every recruiting cycle for 3 years," he said, "I had my team put your name back at the top of the list and try again. You'd gone completely off the map. No firm, no board seats, nothing. I assumed someone had buried you in an ironclad non-compete, or that a competitor overseas had scooped you up quietly. I couldn't understand how someone that good simply vanishes. My mother got sick," Dana said evenly. "I went to take care of her. She died last year." The words landed in the barn with a weight even Faith could not talk over. Dean looked at Dana for a long moment. "So while I had a team searching every firm in the country for you," he said. "You were where, exactly?" "At a hospital," Dana answered. "Then at a funeral. Then figuring out what came next." He nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted from professional interest into something closer to respect. Beside him, Faith had turned the specific shade of gray that comes when a story you've told for years collapses in a single sentence, in front of the one person you most needed it to hold up for. She had a choice in that moment, a version of this where she recovered with grace, where she said simply, "Of course, I'm so proud of my sister. Look what she stepped away from." Instead, she let out a nervous laugh. "Well, I mean, that was ages ago, Dean. She's not really in the industry anymore. She's been out for years. You know how it is. The field moves on." She said it reflexively, the way you'd swat at something small and irritating, without registering that she had just said it about a woman her own CEO had called the backbone of his firm, having minutes earlier introduced that same woman as an unemployed failure at her own nephew's wedding. Dean Ashcroft turned his head slowly and looked at Faith, really looked at her, the way a person rereads a document and catches, the second time, what they missed the first. The warmth left his face, not into anger, into something colder and far more final. He set down the drink Faith had refreshed for him all evening, and the whole barn seemed to hold its breath, forks suspended mid-air at the nearby tables, string lights humming overhead. "Faith," he said, and his voice was quiet enough that people leaned in without meaning to. "I've heard you talk about people in the office before. I told myself it was ambition, sharp elbows, and I gave you room for it." He paused. "But I just watched you introduce your own sister. a woman our entire firm is quietly indebted to, as an unemployed failure at her son's wedding, to impress me. That tells me everything I needed to know, and didn't want to. Faith started to say his name, started to say, "Dean, please," and he raised one hand, not unkindly, simply final. "This isn't the place, and I won't make it one. HR will be in touch first thing Monday. I think you already know why." He said it the way you'd note the time. No raised voice, no scene. The most powerful man in the room had simply, calmly, ended her. Faith made a small, airless sound Dana had never heard from her sister before. And what surprised Dana most, watching her sister come apart, was that she did not feel the bright rush of vindication she might once have imagined. What moved through her instead was something heavier, because a single quiet sentence had just unmade a woman who believed a title made her untouchable, and Dana found, to her own surprise, that she did not actually want her sister unmade. She wanted something else entirely, and she hadn't found the words for it yet. The table dissolved into the particular hush of a wedding absorbing a scandal. Whispered asides, shifting chairs, someone hurrying to find Grant. Her son arrived at the edge of it wide-eyed, looking between his aunt and his mother and his boss, trying to understand how his wedding had turned into this. Priya reached Dana first, one hand light on her shoulder, a young woman planting herself beside the family member everyone else had spent years treating as furniture. Faith sat down heavily in the nearest chair, as if her legs had simply given out, and for one unguarded second, she wasn't performing anything at all. She looked across the wreckage of her own making and said, almost to herself, "You were always the one they remembered." It came out of her like something held underwater for 40 years, and in that single sentence, Dana finally understood what her sister had meant on the phone 3 years earlier, back when the family first decided who would step back to care for their mother. Faith hadn't refused out of heartlessness. She had refused because she was terrified that if she stepped out of her own lit room for even a moment, the world would forget she had ever been standing in it, because she believed, the way she'd always believed, that attention defaulted to her older sister. Her cruelty had never been strength. It had been a woman clutching a rung in the rain, certain that letting go meant disappearing entirely. Dana stood. Everyone in that barn seemed to expect some final line to close the account she'd been keeping against her sister for years. She didn't offer one. Instead, she walked over to Dean Ashcroft, who had stepped a little apart from the table near a post wrapped in grapevine and string lights, and asked if she could have a word. "That was remarkable," he began. "What you built, I owe you." She stopped him gently. "Mr. Ashcroft, I need to ask you something, and it's going to sound strange." He waited. "Don't fire my sister because of me," Dana said. "If she crossed a line your firm draws, that's your business, and you should do whatever it requires. But I need to know it isn't a gift to me. I've spent 3 years being defined by other people, and I'm not going to start my next chapter by having a woman destroyed on my behalf. That's not a win I want to own." He studied her for a long moment, the way a person studies something they weren't expecting to find. Dana realized, saying it, that she was no longer talking only about faith. She was drawing a line about the entire way she intended to let the world hand her things from now on, whether insult or reward, and she meant to be the one holding the pen. Dean Ashcroft smiled, a real one, the first she'd seen from him all evening. "You're exactly the person I spent 3 years looking for," he said. "Now I understand why I couldn't find you. People like you don't leave a trail. You leave a legacy and walk off." Then he made his pitch, and it was serious. Not a consulting engagement, but a leadership seat at Kestrel, running strategy for the entire firm, at a salary large enough that the great aunt still eavesdropping nearby made a small audible noise. He would announce it however Dana wanted, correct the record with a single press release, restore in an afternoon everything 3 years had quietly taken from her. He reached into his jacket, took out one of his own cards, heavy stock, his name and title in clean lettering, and set it on the small table between them. Dana looked down at it and felt the entire weekend narrow to that one rectangle of paper. She considered it, genuinely, fully. Every part of her that had gone hungry for 3 years leaned toward it. Take the title, the salary, the press release, walk back into her old industry vindicated, let the whole professional world that had watched her vanish now watch her return in triumph. It was, by every measure she'd used for 20 years, the win. But wanting a thing and needing it, she had learned, were two different accounts, and her mother had taught her to read a balance sheet. If she took that card, she would once again be a woman whose worth arrived from the outside, granted by a powerful man, printed on stock she hadn't chosen, restored on someone else's letterhead. She would be real again, in exactly the way Faith had always measured real. She would win her sister's game, and a person who wins someone else's game has still agreed to play it. She heard her mother's voice again, clear as the last good week. "They'll measure you by the room you're standing in. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way." And she finally understood, completely, what those 2 years by a hospital bed had actually taught her. That she had spent her whole life believing her value was only the value she produced for other people. That the moment she stopped producing, she became someone between things. Faith lived by that same arithmetic. It was the arithmetic that had made her refuse their mother, that had her clutching her Navy business cards like a life raft, that had nearly convinced Dana, alone on the floor of her own apartment with an old photograph, that a woman without a title was a woman without worth. But Dana had done the most valuable work of her life in a room with no applause in it at all. 2 years no one credited, no one clapped for, no one ever put on a resume, and it had not been a gap. It had been the fullest, truest work she would ever do. She picked up Dean Ashcroft's card, held it a moment so he would understand exactly what she was refusing, and set it gently back on the table. "Thank you," she said, and meant it fully. "You have no idea what it means that you remembered. You saw me when my own family had already decided I was a cautionary tale. I'll carry that. Then, but I'm not taking the seat. It isn't pride. I didn't lose myself out there, Dean. I didn't get lost. This room just forgot how to see. That was never mine to fix by taking a better chair. I don't need to be restored. I need to build my own table. One where the first question isn't what's your title, but who did you take care of?" He was quiet a long moment. Then he laughed softly, picked the card back up, and put it away. "Most people take the chair, Dana," he said. "In 30 years, you're the first one I've offered it to who'd rather build the room. He shook her hand. Then I'll be your first client. And I meant what I said about your sister. That decision is mine to make for my firm, not a favor to you. Exactly as you asked. That distinction is yours. Dana found her son near the cake, standing beside Priya, looking like a man whose beautiful day had cracked down the middle. She took both his hands and told him his wedding was still perfect, that none of what had happened at that table was his to carry, and that his mother was more all right than she had been in 3 years, which was true. Across the barn, Faith sat alone at the emptied table, her Navy cards nowhere in sight, staring at nothing. Dana didn't go to her. There was no repairing it that night, and maybe not any night, and she had made her peace with that. She caught her sister's eye once, across the room, and gave a single small nod. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement. Two sisters raised in the same house, under the same quiet rules about who gets to matter, and only one of them had finally walked free of those rules. Faith looked away first. That was a little over a year ago. Dana built the table she'd told Dean about. A small firm, deliberately so, 3 people, and a handful of serious clients. Dean Ashcroft became the first of them, exactly as promised, and his name opened doors Dana never had to knock on twice. It isn't an empire, and she doesn't want one. She's already lived the version of her life that chases the biggest room, and she isn't going back. Faith left Kestrel that Monday. The industry is small, and word travels, and she eventually landed at a smaller firm 2 states away, a rung lower, still clutching. The sisters are not close, and Dana has stopped waiting for that to change. Some breaks heal enough to stop bleeding without ever healing into something whole again. Grant and Priya come for dinner often now, and Priya is expecting their first child. Last month, Dana interviewed a woman for her own firm who had spent 3 years caring for her father, hands shaking as she reached the gap on her resume, visibly braced for the question everyone else had always asked. Dana didn't ask about the gap. She asked the woman to tell her about her father instead, and knew she would hire her before the woman even finished answering. If there's a quiet person in your life carrying more than the room around them can see, tell them today, before someone else has to say it for you. What would you have done in that barn if you were Dana? Taken the card, or built your own table? Tell us in the comments, and if this story stayed with you, imagine what happens next week, when a father's quiet apology, 30 years too late, unravels a family no one thought could break. Subscribe to Hidden Yet Heard Tales so you don't miss it, and we'll see you in the next one.